There are many themes discussed in the film Indian Horse. Most of the themes are related to the history and culture of the indigenous groups in Canada. Saul, the protagonist in the film, experienced multiple themes that are common in indigenous learning. He experienced the themes of cultural disconnection, oppression, resilience, and reconciliation. While the federal residential school system began around 1883, the origins of the residential school system can be traced to as early as the 1830s, long before Confederation in 1867, when Anglican Church established a residential school in Brantford, Ontario. Through this early period, these mission schools were primarily located in eastern Canada, but as missions and colonial efforts moved west of the Great Lakes, so did the schools. The Canadian government and Canada's churches built the residential school system as a means to solve the Indian question in Canada. The perceived threat and barrier posed by Indigenous peoples to the ongoing construction of the newly forming nation of Canada. The residential schools were all over Canada. They mistreated and abused the Indigenous children. Some of them were starved or frozen to death, just like Channy Winjack. He was taken from his family and died on the way to running away from the residential school he went to. Abuse at the schools was widespread. Emotional and psychological abuse was constant. Physical abuse was known as punishment, and sexual abuse was also common. Survivors recall being beaten and strapped. Some students were shackled to their beds, and some had needles shoved in their tongues for speaking their native language. The Indian Act of 1876 reinforced and legitimated the domination of Indigenous peoples and lands. It has given the Crown control over nearly every aspect of Indigenous peoples' lives and has worked toward assimilation and removal through systems like residential schools and band ceremonies. Later on, the government recognizes that Indigenous self-government and laws are critical to Canada's future, and that Indigenous perspectives and rights must be incorporated in all aspects of this relationship. In doing so, they will continue the process of decolonization and hasten the end of its legacy wherever it remains in our laws and policies. The theme of identity and cultural disconnection is mentioned in the film. It explores the struggle for personal identity. Saul lived with his family since he was little. His grandmother saved him from being taken by the government. Unfortunately, he was caught by the river and left his grandmother forever. He experienced the disconnection from his Indigenous culture by learning Western culture in the residential school. The cultural erasure avoided his sense of self, and he struggled for his identity for a long time. His early life shows the impact of colonization. The theme of oppression is referred to in the film. Saul faced oppression from the residential school and his hockey team. Living under the control of the white world, He had no rights of speech. He was abused by the teachers in school and discriminated against by his teammates, opponents, and the audience in hockey because of his indigenous identity. He was marginalized by the people around him. It shows the difficulty indigenous peoples face when striving for success. It recognizes the injustice indigenous peoples suffered and encourages understanding from the public. The theme of resilience is discussed in the film as well. Saul endured a tough life in both his residential school and hockey team. Despite the trauma he faced, he tried to survive in these circumstances, so he decided to reconnect with his culture and community. He recovered from the death of Catherine and Rebecca, being taken away from his family and being discriminated against. His experience calls for attention from the government and encourages individuals and the government to support those who are being marginalized. Resilience promotes people with strength, survival, healing, and hope. The theme of reconciliation was also stated in the film. It acknowledges the past and develops forgiveness. Saul was healing through reconciliation. He initially struggled with hockey and alcohol, but then he found comfort in acknowledging his trauma and returning to his community and seeking reconciliation with his past. This theme emphasizes the same situation many indigenous peoples faced in their lives. Reconciliation guards the identity and culture of the indigenous peoples. Therefore, Saul learned and developed himself in the life lessons that relate to disconnection with his community, oppression, resilience, and reconciliation. His experience is a mirror of most of the experiences of the indigenous groups. They had the same process of recovery. Learning these themes honors the truth of history, personal reflection, cultural awareness, and expected actions.